decided to hang myself. Well, we had lanyards, you get bootlaces, lanyards, you get all your gear, most of it anyway. And I just tried to string myself up on the window.
Left turn! Forward! 1, 2, 3, 4.
You're told it's a corrective training centre, but if you compare that with a prison, I'm sure I prefer to be in a prison.
2, 3, 4. Move to the right in file right. Turn! Arms in while you're turning and swing your arms.
If the Navy was as it should be, it was a good force, you wouldn't need so much discipline as it is. People would be quite happy to do their job and there wouldn't be for need for such places, DQs.
Left, right, left. Change direction, right wheel.
DQs, the Royal Naval Detention Quarters, Portsmouth, the building which for 60 years has brought the Navy's troublemakers back into line. DQs has always had a reputation for toughness. It's also got one for keeping itself to itself. Even government ministers have difficulty getting information about it. It's taken World in Action 5 months to piece together the facts. Tonight we retrace the last 6 years in the life of the Sailors' Jail. Roughly 750 sailors pass through DQs every year, many of them for jumping ship. The sentences are short, an average of 45 days. Lately, the establishment has caused concern. Increasingly, men have been detained who are patently unsuited to its methods. They're the ticket workers, sailors who commit offences only to get thrown out of the Navy. In DQs, some find they bite off more than they can chew.
It's phenomenally hard, phenomenally hard. I would have never dreamed that they could inflict so much pain. While I was there, a man lacerated his forearms with a razor, and he was taken out of the cell and taken to the sick bay and sewn. He had his arms sewn up, lacerated here, and by 11 o'clock he was back in his cell.
How long after was that?
3 hours. 3 hours afterwards.
World in Action has tracked down 40 former detainees. Bookie did 120 days in 1967 to 1968. Instructors in DQs confirm his story.
I was led off back to the cell where I was left. In withdrawal in cold turkey. It's very difficult to sort of explain that experience. It's a pretty shattering experience, cold turkey. And the most incredible part of it was that none of the naval authorities did anything to relieve the pain I was in cold turkey. No sedatives, no heroin substitute or no heroin to offset the withdrawal. Until eventually they took me off to a military mental hospital.
John Jordan became a drug addict while on the run from the Navy. He was caught and put in DQs for 2 days. While there, he was in such a state that his story may not be 100% correct. John Jordan died earlier this year. He'd been discharged from the Navy in 1969. It seems unfortunate that an unhappy man so unstable should ever have been put in an establishment designed for hard cases. And when he was there, it was very hard. It wasn't all that long since the manacles had been thrown away. Prisoners still couldn't talk to one another at any time. Even a wink brought punishment. The food was abysmal. The men spent long periods locked up. They slept on wooden boards with wooden pillows. The lavatory routine was primitive and humiliating. And at that time, a man could be in DQs for as long as 2 years.
Well, there were a lot of practices going on that simply were indefensible. There was a rule of silence. The way we treated the men who were in there, we weren't giving them enough actual calories in their food. They were often in their cells for too long. Now, of course, naval officers, naturally enough, feel that this is one of their provinces. They are not too keen, quite frankly, on politicians interfering. I don't think we should interfere, normally, but in this particular case, it was impossible to defend, both in Parliament and outside. This was a bad anomaly. I mean, it should not have existed. We shouldn't have reached 1968 with a detention quarters like this in this country.
Some high-up brass hat in the Navy had even tried to prevent the minister responsible from the Navy from visiting these DQ which is pretty good cheek in a democracy where it's not a military dictatorship. They have political heads and so on.
Tell us which minister that was.
I think it was Maurice Foley.
Yes, I did meet a measure of obstruction. Firstly, there was the surprise, evinced in certain quarters, that I should even ask. And I had to remind people that I was the minister, and I was determined to go. Secondly, there was a great deal of administrative delay, something like 3 months from the time that I asked to go till ultimately arriving there.
Arm behind the doors. Stand by to jump out with your drinking mug. Stand by. Out! Right and left. Now when you come down, collect your razor, mug of hot water from the centre, back to your room and shave.
Because it's the same routine every day. It never varies, it never changes, not even a word. I mean, the chief of staff stands for in the morning, and you could tape record it and you wouldn't get an if or a but, anything would be different. It's always the same. It's just no point in having a brain in there. I mean, you could be an half-wit.
Ratings who wrote letters yesterday, when you return your razor, return your letter and pen. When you've returned your razor, you carry out breakfast time routine. When you've completed the routine, take your scrubber and deck cloth in. And I'll remind you, do not shave from your drinking mug. You tip the water in your bowl. Double mark!
Try to break you mentally, and they're continually at you all the time saying that you are a fool, that you're trying to kick the system, and they're telling you that their way of life is the only way of life, it's the correct way of life, and they forever tell you you're a mug, that you can't win.
Under pressure from the politicians, changes began. Dr. David Owen, who followed Mr. Foley into office in July 1968, ordered an internal report, which even now the ministry will not release. The report recommended changes. In December 1969, a full range of reforms were undertaken. TV was provided for the early evening news, beds replaced wooden boards, and though meal times remained short, the men were allowed to eat together. 10 days before we filmed, the television time was extended. But solitary confinement is still a punishment with a diet of bread and water, and the obsession with bull remains. A prisoner can still go to the lavatory only at 2 set times a day. Men strain not to use their lavatory pans at night, so they don't have to polish them to perfection in the morning.
I personally think, I'm saying nothing more than I said for 2 years as minister, that the Navy uses detention too frequently as a punishment. And I think that this is not in keeping with the mood of the times.
How many suicide attempts do you think there were in Portsmouth DQs in your time?
I know of none actually taking place inside the naval DQs during the 2 years I was there, and I would have been surprised if I hadn't been told of it.
World in Action has been told of 9 cases of attempted suicide and 22 of solitary confinement being used since Dr. Owen's reforms. And we've seen only a fraction of the men who've been through DQs in that time. We also know of 1 prisoner who attempted suicide and 9 who went into solitary while Dr. Owen was actually in office.
What about solitary confinement?
Well, this is used very rarely.
6.5 months ago, Frank Judd, a Portsmouth MP who was still getting complaints about DQs, went to see for himself.
We've talked to boys who were in there when you went round. They say that the routine was quite substantially changed or toned down for your visit.
I say, and I say again, that the really valuable part of my visit was being able to look at the physical situation, the buildings, the cells, things of this sort. I didn't, frankly, take too much notice of what I saw the men doing.
Everyone was locked up. So the only 3 people he's seen, the only 3 inmates he's seen were me and 2 other men. And he only saw us for a few seconds as we walked past him, that was all.
Did he ask you any questions?
None at all.
Did he ask anybody any questions?
No, no inmates at all, he didn't say anything to anyone.
Was the routine at all changed when he came round?
Yes, it was hustled so that everyone would be locked up earlier. You know, so you couldn't possibly have seen any of them.
What was hustled?
Well, you know, all the working parties, they were cleaning up toilets and corridors and all the cells, and all this was done earlier so they couldn't be locked up for when he came.
So do you think that he had any opportunity to get a real feel of what it was like in there?
None at all. All he could have seen was the buildings, that's all. And talk to the staff, that was all he did. Looking at any bunch of buildings.
Did you get any feeling when you were in there that there was a whitewash being laid on?
Look, I was in the services, you know, leave aside a prison. If a newspaper reporter, if a television crew, if an MP is going to a service establishment, or indeed to any official establishment, it's not a normal day, it can't be. And therefore one of the things that one has got to try and do intelligently and sensibly is to try and look behind the situation as you see it on the occasion of a rather special arrangement, a public presence of that kind.
5 months before Mr. Judd's visit, a government committee, the Donaldson Committee, went into DQs as part of their inquiry into recruiting. In one paragraph in their final report, a paragraph which did not attract publicity at the time, they concluded, "Conditions at the naval DQs at Portsmouth are rigorous. A man who will choose to go through such prolonged punishments must be so determined to get out that his case probably deserves exceptional treatment. Alternatively, he may be an inadequate who finds it impossible to conform and who should not be kept in on any grounds." This well-in-action film was the first ever shot in DQs. After our visit, we might have concluded that conditions inside were now tolerable, but we'd already interviewed at length 40 former prisoners. Many have been in recently, their painful stories often cross-checked. Drinkwater claims he heard a man screaming in a cell. Some people do go off their heads, he told us. Bryson said, in the first week you can't speak at all. It drives you insane. Sparrow said he was made to do the assault course even though a doctor declared him medically unfit because of an abscess on his spine. Jonathan Brooks did not take to the detention quarters at all. He said,
"It's like a nightmare, really. DQs is like a nightmare, and you don't remember nightmares."
Kenwyn Tart said, "I was horrified when I first walked in because it was so quiet." Davy talked inside to a sailor who tried to hang himself. The man told him, "I got to the point where I just didn't care anymore." The Navy claims the purpose of DQs is to reform sailors. It didn't work with this man. We hadn't identified him because he's still in the Navy and still aching to get out.
Arms in while you're turning and swing your arms.
Most of the men we spoke to had joined the Navy in their teens, some as early as 15. Each had at least one thing in common. He'd been prepared to face DQs to get discharged. None of the 38 who finally got out now regrets leaving.
Shoulder!
They've served the Queen and their country and everything. I mean, well, it's fair enough. If a bloke wants to do it, let him do it. But I don't think he should try and make everybody else do it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Went to join the first ship, and the first job I was given was a piece of wire to polish guardrails. I thought, oh, it'll only be a couple of days before I'm put to work on a decent job. And after that, it was just a succession of messmen, toilet cleaning, etc., etc.
But the Navy has its problems too. It couldn't survive if it automatically released every man who wanted to get out. DQs is the ultimate deterrent, but it can be the breaking point for some reluctant sailors.
Right in file, right. Turn. Order. Up. Left, right. Move to the right. Left, right, left.
You've got enough pressure on your mind to do anything. And the pressure builds up in there. You're on your own, you're locked up. I mean, my dog gets treated better than what they do in DQs.
Before Jeff Snook went into the Navy, he won an award for bravery. He saved a man's life after an explosion. On the surface, Snook seemed perfect material for the Navy, but things went wrong.
And I thought about it all through the first 3 or 4 weeks of, you know, getting out of it one way or another. And it stuck in my mind about hanging myself all the time.
Can you understand anybody being driven to the point of wanting to take their lives?
I can understand any man in there, because many a time I thought about it.
He just got a letter from his wife saying she'd left him. And this guy was only about 18 or 19 years old. And it was during the dinner after he got the mail that he apparently had torn a polish tin in two and slashed his wrist with it. I saw him being carried out you know, as we went back to normal routine, as we were going out onto the parade ground, he's been carried out in a stretcher, and his face was pale. I only caught a glimpse of him, you know, I just saw a whitey sort of face in a stretcher. But later on that afternoon, about 3 hours later, he was back. It was just with bandages in his arms, that's all. And he was back to normal routine.
What was it like in solitary?
Your place in solitary is just a bare stone wall, stone floored cell. There's a plastic urinal and a plastic cup in there, and that's all. And you're just left in there. The doctor visits once a day, and he keeps it strictly to the question of have you any medical complaints? And you're left there all day. You're given 4 slices of bread and a cup of water per day. And at night, you're given a wooden board about 5 to 6 feet long, about 3 feet wide to sleep on. And if the temperature drops below 57 degrees, you're given a blanket. And I believe if it drops further than 57, you're given another blanket. But it's very cold. There's some inscriptions scrawled on the wall. You read them 100 times, and you try and sleep, but the cold gets to you and you can't sleep.
Yeah, they were so proud of this solitary cell, you know, because people didn't like it. It was so bad in there. And they were very proud of it, actually, because people didn't like it.
I tied a lanyard to the handle of the window and stood on my stool. And when I jumped off the stool, I didn't jump off as such. It was more of, I didn't want to do it, and I did. You know, it's a very hard thing to do, to try to kill yourself.
When you went into the Navy, could you have conceived of yourself attempting to commit suicide?
No. No.
It seems a pretty strange thing to you now, too.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was a serious attempt to commit suicide.
Oh, yeah, it was serious, yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, how many 20-year-old blokes cry? There aren't many.
What do you mean you cried?
I was crying most of the time, you know, while I was trying to do it. You know, I mean, my state of mind, well, I just don't know, you can't, it's hard to explain, actually.
If somebody was to say that you made a pretty bad job of trying to commit suicide, and they couldn't believe that you'd attempted to do it, what would you say?
Try and do it yourselves, because it's a bloody hard thing to do.
Our complete file contains 15 accounts of attempted suicide and 44 of solitary confinement. At least 30 boys under the age of 18 have apparently gone into DQs. There are 18 allegations of men who are unfit to go through their routine. 9 sailors are said to have cracked up. These incidents all occurred over the past 6 years, a large number of them in the past 12 months. The reforms seem to have made little difference to the regularity of such incidents.
I think this is a most unhappy way of having to get out of the Navy. If a young man who went in before he was able really to know what he was doing decides that he doesn't like service life, I think it's intolerable that he should have to go through this process of going back over and over again.
My own feeling is that now the balance is much nearer to being correct, and if we put it in, rebuild it, take it away from Portsmouth and flatten the present detention quarters and put it all under the 3 services, Army, Air Force and Navy, detention quarters at Colchester, this would seem to me much the most sensible solution, and certainly what I would have done if I'd stayed.
I really think that a bulldozer for a large part of the DQs at Portsmouth wouldn't do any harm.
We've refrained from putting forward allegations which do not seem convincing. The current Minister for the Navy, Mr. Peter Kirk, has studied our main cases. Without access ourselves to the official records, our figures are necessarily incomplete, and in the case of suicide attempts, it's sometimes difficult to assess how serious they were. Certainly some were very serious indeed.
Mr. Kirk, we've presented you with a dossier. Can you tell me what you think of what these men have had to say? Are you at all troubled by their stories?
Of course, one's never entirely happy with any establishment of this kind. But I think the reforms which started under my predecessor and which I've tried to carry on have created conditions within the DQs which would now be regarded as acceptable. We're still not completely satisfied. I don't think one can ever be totally satisfied with any human institution. But what we are now trying to do is, in the light of the reforms and the solid progress that we have made, to bring the administration of the DQs up to date, to provide a naval environment for rehabilitation of naval offenders.
Now, Dr. Owen has said that any minister who enters the field of discipline is going to meet resistance from the Navy.
Have you yourself met resistance?
I've met no resistance at all. I've met the fullest possible cooperation from all my service colleagues on the Admiralty Board and from those administering the DQs.
Do you think that there has been a change over recent years?
I wouldn't know. I wasn't here when Dr. Owen was Minister.
He also told us that he spends a lot of time defending decisions that he wouldn't dream of defending normally because of the Naval Discipline Act. Do you feel the same?
No, obviously there are times when my judgment differs from that of those responsible for administering the Naval Discipline Act. This happens in any ministry at any time, but in general I would say that I have a great understanding of what worries them, and because we are in a period of transition, obviously one's in a period when mistakes are going to be made. But we try as far as possible to minimize mistakes, and I think we succeed.
Now, you've said in the comments that you've taken a close personal interest in the DQ's problem. Have you been round DQ?
Yes.
When did you go round?
Last September.
And can you tell us how long you were in there?
I suppose a period of about 2.5 hours.
And did you talk to any of the inmates?
No, I talked to the staff, but not to the inmates.
But do you feel that you got a satisfactory picture from your visit?
Yes, indeed. And of course I have spoken to sailors on board ships who have been in DQs.
And what would you say your impressions were of DQs from that 2.5 hours?
I would say that within the limits of the building and the circumstance that the staff are doing about the best job they could possibly do there. There are certain things that obviously if we had more staff, if we had more money, or if we had a better building, we could do better. Nobody disputes that for a moment. But given the limitations that we have, I think that the job is being done about as well as it could be done. But of course I'm talking now about a period after the reforms that were initiated by David Owen, and which I've carried on.
Mr. Kirk, we have the impression from our material that your predecessor, despite his energy, was not fully informed about DQs. For example, he was not aware of the wide use of solitary confinement as a punishment. Do you yourself feel that you may be making decisions in the dark?
Well, that's always a danger for any minister, of course. I've done the best to inform myself as fully as I can about it. I am aware of the wide use of the use of solitary confinement. I wouldn't use the word wide in this connection.
How often would you say it was used?
It can't be used for a period of more than 3 days, in any case, without the authority of the Commodore of the Barracks at Portsmouth. And I would have said it's used in those cases very infrequently. When I was there was one man in solitary confinement.
Do you know what a man would eat when he was in solitary confinement?
He has a very restricted diet, yes.
Which would be?
Bread and water, I think, but I wouldn't swear to that.
But can I just press the general question? Do you feel that sometimes you are operating in the dark on the subject of DQs?
I feel I'm operating in the dark sometimes on any subject.
Inevitably, no minister can know every detail in his department. World in Action, too, is in the dark to some degree. But it seems that despite the reforms, there has been too much unnecessary hardship in the sailors' jail.
Every other one, every other side. Right, left. Right, well.